many times from my small businesses across all multiple industries about significant delays and problems that they are having with supply chains, specifically as how that relates to ocean shipping. And the bottom line is this: small businesses and families throughout Michigan, as well as all across the country, are experiencing higher prices and major delays associated with importing and exporting their products and their supplies. The ocean shipping network, which is responsible for 90% of the global trade, has gone from being a system that was both fast and cost-effective to one plagued by delays and exorbitant pricing practices. Certainly many factors have contributed to this shift, but one major cause has been the global economy's uneven recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic and the resulting supply chain collapses that have resulted from that. In short, our supply chains can be very efficient, but they are not resilient. This is an issue that I'm committed to improving and addressing. Back in 2019, through my role as Senate Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee, as ranking member at that time, I released a report on the rising cost of prescription drugs, and one of the takeaways from that report was that in a major event such as a pandemic, our supply chains were not going to be prepared to deal with it. And sure enough, when the pandemic hit, we had major shortages of personal protection equipment and other kinds of medical supplies because of our over-reliance on foreign suppliers. And right now, we're having an ongoing semiconductor chip shortage that's hurting our auto workers and our auto manufacturers. These shortages and disruptions pose not only a threat to our national security, but also have devastating impacts on Michiganders, their families, businesses, and workers all across the country. For instance, automakers and their suppliers have consistently encountered skyrocketing penalties and fees charged by ocean shippers. Combined with heightened volatility around ocean shipping logistics, these conditions have actually diminished auto production. There are examples of ocean carriers not fulfilling their commitment to move the product of small and medium-sized businesses. Retailers have had to pay 6 to 10 times the standard amount in shipping cost in order to get products to their stores and on their shelves. And even then, they've seen contract brokers decline to honor those agreed upon amounts. Members of the agriculture industry have seen their orders routinely get rolled, oftentimes only after learning they've already incurred substantial demurrage fees. And these are just a few of the many, many examples that I could talk about. I certainly applaud the Biden administration's swift efforts to counter some of these challenges, whether it's been multiple executive orders empowering the Federal Maritime Commission, working with major ports. President Biden has taken important and necessary steps to better secure our ocean shipping supply chains against vulnerabilities. We have already begun to see some positive results of these efforts. Just last week, the CEOs of major retailers told President Biden that supply chain conditions have begun to show some signs of improvement. Additionally, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act will help ease inflationary pressures and strengthen supply chains by making long overdue investments in our nation's ports, airports, rails, and roads. And the Build Back Better Act will take many steps to lower costs for families. The Senate Commerce Committee has also addressed this issue from multiple angles in recent months, from a freight mobility supply chain hearing that I chaired through this subcommittee in May, to a full committee hearing held in July that focused on implementing supply chain resiliency. The multifaceted challenges facing our supply chains are going to require, however, a holistic response from all sectors, including from ports, where I believe the Great Lakes ports can play a significant part in reducing backlogs. Ports in Michigan and across the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Seaway system are ready-made relief valves that are currently underutilized. And as we explore solutions to strengthen our shipping and supply chains, we must be sure to look to the Great Lakes, our nation's, I would say our nation's best coast, to help fill in the gaps when possible. Additionally, there are roles for both the federal government and private industry to play in alleviating our supply chain pressures and challenges. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses here today about the practices they have found to be successful in addressing supply chain challenges associated with ocean shipping and where gaps continue to plague logistics. I'd now like to invite Ranking Member Fisher to share her opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Peters, and thank you for holding this hearing on ocean shipping bottlenecks as we are in the midst of the holiday season. It would be an understatement to say that the past year and a half has been rough for many Americans. In addition to the public health crisis, our supply chain and transportation networks have experienced immense strains throughout this pandemic. Grocery stores are struggling to keep shelves stocked again with the current freight bottlenecks across the country. While we hoped these disruptions would be a temporary problem, it is clear that we will have to deal with this crisis for the foreseeable future. Industry experts believe the supply chain disruptions could persist into late 2022 or even into 2023. Today's hearing will highlight the impacts the port backlog is having on American businesses, including Preferred Popcorn of Chapman, Nebraska. I am pleased to introduce my friend, Norm Krug, who founded Preferred Popcorn in 1997. 50% of Preferred Popcorn's business is overseas, exporting to 70 countries around the world. While he was able to export 1,500 containers of popcorn last year, it should have been much more. Mr. Krug informed my office that over 900 of his containers were unable to be picked up for delivery. In other words, over 1/3 of Norm's export business was not shipped due to disruptions, and that is unacceptable. Norm will be able to provide this committee with more insight on how the supply chain disruptions are affecting the agriculture export industry, and I look forward to hearing his testimony. Unfortunately, Norm is not the only Nebraska business leader who has reached out to my office about the supply chain disruptions. I've heard from individuals who have had to send employees home because their supply was stuck in a warehouse on the West Coast and they didn't have work for them. Another business informed me that they were having to start producing more products outside the United States facilities because the cost of exporting their product is becoming too expensive. Additionally, many Americans are concerned about being able to purchase goods ahead of this holiday season. Grocery stores across the country are struggling to maintain consistent inventory, and retail sector analysts are already warning that Christmas orders will likely be delayed. I was joined by many of my Senate colleagues, including Chairman Peters, in supporting the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which was recently signed into law. While this legislation will provide historic investments into our nation's freight system, this will not be a short-term fix. I hope this hearing will provide Congress with a better understanding of how these disruptions impact American businesses. Additionally, I hope we can have a productive conversation with the witnesses to discuss how shippers and carriers can work to alleviate bottlenecks across this supply chain. Finally, I believe this committee should have additional hearings on this topic to understand how transportation operators and the administration are addressing the supply chain challenges that we are discussing today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you, Ranking Member Fisher. We'll now introduce our witnesses. Our first witness today.
Mr. Chairman.
Oh, yes.
I have
Member Wicker?
brief opening statement.
Oh, sorry. Absolutely.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. U.S. manufacturers, retailers, consumers, and workers face enormous challenges stemming from freight and supply chain congestion. The effect will become even more pronounced as Christmas is upon us, and families are trying to purchase gifts for their loved ones amid soaring prices. These transportation bottlenecks show no signs of letting up. High levels of freight congestion are expected well into next year. I have heard from many supply chain stakeholders about the complexity of moving such a vast amount of goods, and indeed, the situation is complex. We've all seen images of ships waiting for miles offshore to unload their cargo. The lack of port terminal and warehouse space continues, as well as limitations on intermodal equipment and workforce disruptions. All of this makes it harder for truckers and railroads as they work to move containers. On top of all this, vaccine mandates could have a major impact on the transportation sector. The trucking industry estimates that the employer-based vaccination mandate could result in the loss of up to 37% of drivers for covered companies. Mr. Chairman, we simply cannot absorb that level of disruption. It would be impossible to cover every aspect of the supply chain challenges in one sitting. But I appreciate Senator Peters and Senator Fisher for holding today's hearing. I also want to join Senator Fisher in urging the committee to hold additional hearings on the supply chain with witnesses from the administration and from land-based transportation operators. Recently, I led a letter with several of my colleagues requesting a briefing from the administration on how they plan to address these supply chain issues. I'd like, at this point, Mr. Chairman, to ask unanimous consent to insert that letter into the record at this point.
Without objection.
Thank you, sir. The administration has made few attempts at solving the problems, such as announcing back in early October that the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach would be open 24/7. But as the Washington Post reported just a week ago, that has yet to happen. And at this point, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record that Washington Post story confirming that this is yet to happen.
Without objection, so entered.
Supply chains are still jammed up. In fact, just one port of Los Angeles terminal has experimented, just one, with 24/7 operations. But according to the port director, quote, "We've had very few takers," unquote, to this one experiment in one port of Los Angeles. Very few takers for those extended hours because of a shortage of truckers and warehouse workers. They seemed reluctant to show up at 3 in the morning to load goods onto their trucks. The administration, and this does really concern me, the administration has claimed that the number of vessels waiting off ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach is decreasing. The only way they can make that claim is that they are using a new counting method, requiring ships to queue up over 150 miles off the California coast. As of December 4th, over 96 ships were waiting for berths. And at this point, Mr. Chair, I ask unanimous consent to insert into the record a Bloomberg article in this regard.
Without objection, will be entered.
In other words, there are just as many ships still out there. Cooking the numbers is not a solution. And I'm disappointed at the administration for attempting to suggest that that has been a solution. I've been disappointed by the resistance to modernizing port and freight operations. For example, automated terminals and trucks or new technologies could improve efficiency and transparency within the supply chain. There are steps that should be taken to support the movement of goods. I welcome the President's signature on the bipartisan infrastructure bill. This includes much-needed investments in traditional infrastructure and will result in long-term benefits to the supply chain to help minimize future bottlenecks. Furthermore, senators are working on legislative solutions. I recently introduced the Freight Act with Senators Capito, Moran, Young, Blackburn, Thune, and Sullivan. This legislation would spur improvements to our freight transportation system, streamline the certification process for truck drivers, address unlawful shipping conduct, and provide oversight of transportation operations. Senator Blackburn has legislation to incentivize a private sector-led chassis pool in Memphis. As a major inland port, Memphis needs to increase its ability to operate more efficiently in our interconnected freight system, which stresses from coast to coast. And I want to applaud Senator Moran for leading a letter to the Federal Maritime Commission, which I joined. That letter encouraged the Commission to engage with the ports and swiftly address any unjust or unreasonable aspects of the new dwell fees. There are limits to what the government can do. The challenges facing our supply chains are enormous, as I said, complex, and involve numerous stakeholders around the globe. If we're not careful, a heavy government hand could result in additional congestion rather than solutions. But thank you to the witnesses, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence. I look forward to the testimony.
Well, thank you, Ranking Member Wicker. Our first witness today is Mr. John Butler, who is the CEO of the World Shipping Council, also known as WSC. Mr. Butler is here representing more than 20 members of the liner shipping industry who operate approximately 90% of the global liner ship capacity. Mr. Baker has many years of experience working with the shipping industry, including as a partner at Shear and Blackwell, where he served as outside counsel to the WSC. Welcome, Mr. Butler. You may proceed with your opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Peters, Ranking Member Fisher, members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the invitation to testify today. This hearing is appropriately titled. We truly are in uncharted waters. We've experienced localized port congestion in the past, but what we're seeing today is completely unprecedented. In the 60-plus years of containerized shipping, this is the first time that we have seen global supply chain congestion. And of course, it took a global pandemic to put us in this spot. I'd like to leave you with 4 points today. The first one I just mentioned, which is that the supply chain congestion that we're experiencing is global and it's triggered by COVID. The second point that I'd like to make is that ocean carriers have put every ship and every container that they can buy, charter, or repair into service. The problems are not caused by a lack of ships or containers. We have plenty of those. The problem is that when we get to port, we can't get in. And Senator Wicker made reference to the many, many ships, for example, waiting to come to berth off of Southern California. There's too much cargo coming in because of this import surge for the landside infrastructure to process. And that's the terminals, that's the railroads, that's the trucks, that's the warehouses, all the way out to the end consumer. And a lot of that has been further complicated by the shift to e-commerce. That part of the supply chain is handling things in ways that are different than the models that we had before. And as a result of those problems and the fact that the entire supply chain is saturated, what we're seeing in too many instances is customers are using marine terminals and containers and chassis as temporary storage facilities. And that means that cargo is sitting on the terminals. It means that empty equipment is not coming back to be given to the next customer. And all of that feeds a lack of velocity that makes it difficult to serve everyone. And that's really just the very definition of congestion. The third point I'd like to make is that even though we're facing very real supply chain challenges, and the problems that you have both raised in your opening statements are real. There's no question about it, and we're absolutely conscious of that. But the fact is, at the same time, we are moving a record amount of cargo, and the system has been moving a record amount of cargo for the last 18 months. And you have my commitment that we will continue to do that. And fourth and finally, the last thing I'd like to speak to is the government policy response. And frankly, as ocean carriers, we're getting mixed messages on this front. On the one hand, for example, the administration is pressing us to get our customers to come to the ports and pick up their cargo so that we can get it out of the way and move additional cargo. At the same time, we have a House bill and an expected Senate bill that would restrict the ability to use detention and demurrage incentives to get that job done. As another example of the mixed messages, we're being told by the administration that we must put empty containers on outbound ships in order to clear the ports. Again, at the same time, the proposed legislation in both chambers would say that we have to load all export boxes before we can load empties. So we're getting mixed messages on that front as well. One of the things that I'm not sure everyone fully appreciates is that we don't run separate import and export ships. It's a single continuous loop with the same ships and the same facilities serving everyone. And so when the system becomes overloaded, it affects both importers and exporters, even though the main surge is coming from the import side. When that's in balance, we can manage it. When it's not, it becomes harder to do. The last thing I would say, and where I'd like to close, is to say, and Senator Wicker made reference to this, there is no legislative silver bullet on this, but it is possible to make the situation worse. And there are some proposals in the legislation that's kicking around, frankly, that would take away some of the tools we need and put the federal government in the middle of running a very complex network. We would urge you to move very cautiously in taking those steps to make sure that we don't end up with a situation that's worse than what we have now. Thank you very much for the time.
Well, thank you, Mr. Butler. Our second witness today is Mr. Greg Reagan, President of the Transportation Trades Department at the AFL-CIO, also known as TTD. In that role, Mr. Reagan leads and oversees the daily operation of a labor organization consisting of 33 unions that together represent workers in all areas of transportation. Mr. Reagan also serves as TTD's spokesperson and chief strategist, working with elected leaders on both sides of the aisle to fight for long-term investments in our transportation system and to ensure that jobs in this sector are both safe and secure. Welcome to the hearing. You may proceed with your opening statements.
Thanks. I'm a little used to an unmute button. It's nice to see a physical one here. But thank you, Chairman Peters and Ranking Member Fisher, for inviting me to discuss the challenges facing America's supply chain and freight network. The employees represented by TTD's 33 affiliated unions are on the front lines of these challenges, including workers directly engaged in the freight transportation at railroads, ports, and in trucking, as well as those who work in industries like manufacturing that are grappling with the rippling effects of supply chain choke points and delays. Ultimately, there is no lone actor, decision, or policy that is responsible for this situation. However, we must acknowledge the long-term structural issues going back 40 years that must be addressed so that we do not find ourselves in this same place when the next crisis occurs. The historic rise in cargo volume has stressed every component of the freight transportation network, frequently to the breaking point. And this includes workers, many of whom have been pushed past the brink of exhaustion. I must be perfectly clear on one point. Workers are not the cause of this crisis, but they are working around the clock to fix it. Putting any amount of blame for this crisis on the shoulders of hardworking Americans who drive our economy through thick and thin is unacceptable. This is particularly true when such scapegoating is done as an excuse to undermine collective bargaining rights or further deteriorate their safety or working conditions. Instead, let's acknowledge that short-sighted industry practices and decades-long underinvestment in supply chain infrastructure have rendered our supply chain incapable of meeting the current soaring demand for goods. Unfortunately, while the drastic spike in demand was unpredictable, the results were in many ways inevitable. For example, the lack of elasticity among freight railroads has worsened the supply chain challenges. For years, Class I railroads have pursued an operating model known as precision scheduled railroading, or PSR. Through the PSR model, the railroads all but ensured that their operations would not be able to rapidly respond to economic shocks or rapid changes in the flow of traffic like those we are now seeing. The real-world impact of the freight railroad's business model is that they slashed a staggering 20% of their workforce in the 5 years prior to the pandemic. When greater and more reliable freight service was obviously needed, the railroads only dug in further to their skeleton crew operations and continually prioritized profits over people. Some claim a shortage of employees in the supply chain as a major factor in this crisis. Such claims imply that the workers needed to perform a job do not exist in our current market. This is simply not true. The truth is that many employers fail to provide the incentives, including good wages, working conditions, and benefits that will attract and retain skilled workers. In the trucking industry, for example, blatant worker misclassifications artificially suppressed wages and made working conditions untenable. This is also true in rail, where our unions report mid-career employees walking away from formerly good jobs and secure retirements due to eroding workplace conditions. We are unequivocal. PSR and other industry practices have resulted in a network that was less prepared for this crisis. There are no overnight fixes to our supply chain challenges. When the scope of disruptions became clear, the administration established a whole-of-government response that paved the way for nimble and integrated collaboration and planning. The Biden administration's decisive actions are already yielding positive results. Just since the beginning of November, we've seen a 41% reduction in containers sitting on our docks for over 9 days. While there have been misleading, if not outright falsified, claims of empty store shelves, the on-shelf availability of goods at grocery and drugstores has, in fact, effectively returned to pre-pandemic levels. Ocean shipping costs remain high, but they are now showing signs of meaningful decrease. Decisive and focused actions have made a difference here. Policymakers, including those in Congress, must, however, address the systemic problems that put us in this situation in the first place. In doing so, we call on you to work closely with supply chain employees and their union representatives across the nation to develop real, long-term solutions. Congress and economic regulators must consider and address the impacts that drastic reduction in the rail workforce and degradation in service quality have had on supply chain disruptions, let alone whether current railroad operations are consistent with our statutory common carrier obligations. I would like to thank Senator Baldwin for introducing an amendment to the NDAA, which would give the Surface Transportation Board more tools and authority to address bad behavior by the railroads. Solutions must also include robust and well-directed investments in our nation's freight infrastructure. To that end, we strongly applaud the enactment of the IIJA, the Infrastructure Act, which provides $2.2 billion for the Port Infrastructure Development Program, offering a lifeline to the almost half of all U.S. ports, who state that better rail access could increase their throughput capacity by over 25%. Historic investments in the rail network and in multimodal development will similarly act to prevent or blunt future supply chain challenges. Congress should also consider novel approaches to supply chain challenges that would create jobs and economic activity. For example, the expansion of waterborne transportation alternatives to our marine highways may ease supply chain bottleneck, particularly at major ports. And finally, we once again call on you to reject ill-conceived efforts to manipulate the crisis to attack workers themselves. The pursuit of a more efficient supply chain cannot be an excuse to eliminate regulatory safeguards or attack collective bargaining rights. Thank you again for the opportunity, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Regan, for your comments. Next, our third witness today is Mr. Paul Doyle, the CEO of Coastal Automotive, a small, forward-looking automotive safety component manufacturer headquartered in Holland, Michigan, with manufacturing facilities there and with sales and technical team in Rochester Hills, Michigan. Mr. Doyle has a wealth of experience, having spent over 20 years in the manufacturing industry before leading Coastal Automotive. Mr. Doyle, welcome. You may proceed with your opening comment.
Chairman Peters, Ranking Member Fisher, and committee members, on behalf of all the employees of Coastal Automotive, as well as my colleagues at the Motor and Equipment Manufacturers Association and its division, the Original Equipment Suppliers Association, I'm really thrilled to be here today to share our experiences as a Michigan manufacturer as you wrestle with the solutions to the tangled web that is our supply chain reality. Both MEMA and OESA represent over 900,000 team members in the United States, and Coastal makes up a small but proud 200 of those. I've worked in the automotive market for 33 years, and I have never seen such a combination of issues facing our manufacturers, including those of the Great Recession of 2007 to 2009. Coastal Automotive is a small company, but we have a global footprint. We do all of our manufacturing and our R&D in Michigan. The main product we make is a specialized foam responsible for head impact safety. Our products are in well over 60% of all vehicles on the road in the United States. As many have said, there is no singular root cause to this challenge that we're facing. In the last 20 months, automotive manufacturing has been challenged by COVID, multiple challenges with semiconductor supply and demand, labor shortages, Suez Canal blockages, increased trucking demands driven by COVID-related home shopping, enhanced and extended unemployment, increasing material and wage costs, port shipping and trucking infrastructure issues, and I'm not blaming nor complaining. It's just the landscape that we're dealing with. In April of 2020, coastal sales dropped from about 5 million per month to about 500,000. What we did in response defies everything I know about managing a lean operation. But between clever management and the PPP dollars, and thank you for that, by the way, we remain a viable business today. But here's our current situation. We receive through East Coast ports roughly 250 sea containers each year from Greece. And like most, we have seen delays and extended lead times. We have a long-term agreement with our largest supplier, which expires in April of 2022, and we expect about a 20% increase in cost. The increase is based largely on the cost of their logistics. Shipping containers have gone up to $27,000 compared to pre-pandemic levels of around $3,000. Storage and demurrage charges at the docks, subsequent transportation cost on rail to Chicago and truck to Michigan. In the last 20 months, we've been required to order and receive inventory in a manner other than just in time. Our main supplier is much bigger than we are, so when the ships, docks, and trucks do get a load rolling, our contract is not going to prevent our suppliers from sending to our docks 5 times the number of trucks than we have agreed to or are prepared to receive. Quoted lead times mean little anymore. Capital equipment purchases from both China and Korea have been 20 to 29 weeks beyond quoted expectations. We ship to 30 different countries around the world, and we are regularly informed that trucks will not arrive on scheduled ship dates for lack of trucks and drivers. Our material cost as a percentage of sales next year will be 25% higher, and our labor costs will be 20% higher as well. As you noted, Mr. Peters, global logistics is not the only issue facing coastal and the automotive manufacturers. As the ports and supply chains eventually get untangled, we will be left with other parts of the web that will also require attention. The well-known semiconductor shortage issue, raw material and labor cost increases that are unlikely to move back down to pre-pandemic levels, Section 301 tariffs on China, as well as Section 232 steel and aluminum tariffs. While I expect 2022 will remain tough for the automotive suppliers, I am confident we will solve the supply chain issues in time. And when we do, my fear is that we're going to find waiting for us the very serious matter of an acute worker shortage. Currently, we are running 10 to 15% below our required staffing levels, and when demand returns, that's going to worsen proportionally. Sickness, fear, continued state and federal pandemic relief, and COVID guidelines, combined with a massive economic growth, has caused significant distress to the labor market. A final point I would like to make is regarding cash flow, profitability, and investment. Occupant safety is the purpose of coastal automotive, but profit is the gas in our tank to fund our future, to fund innovation. The automotive industry is once again in the middle of a technological transformation. The 2 major growth areas are the electrification of the vehicle and automated technologies, which is in large measure all about safety. The new infrastructure bill has included a proposal to review NHTSA safety standards, which is something we fully support. We've been a 3-time Supplier of the Year to General Motors, but by virtue of our reduced cash and profit, I suspect that we are 2 years behind in our product innovation. The reduction in profitability also reduces our ability to provide better working conditions for our team members, reduces our ability to provide training and team member development, reduces our ability to support our communities, and as noted, significantly reduces our ability to invest in growing, and in doing so, create and maintain a sustainable business. The ports and shipping issues are indeed a tangled web, and we need your help with fast solutions for breaking down silos and bringing government and private sectors together to solve this problem. We hope that our comments bring clarity, compassion, and urgency to your deliberations, because there's 900,000 MEMA team members affected, and every day I get to look 200 of them in the eye. And all they want is the opportunity to do meaningful work and provide for the dreams of their family. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Mr. Doyle, for your comments. Our last witness today is Mr. Norman Krug, who serves as the CEO of Preferred Popcorn, which is based out of Chapman, Nebraska. Mr. Krug founded Preferred Popcorn nearly 25 years ago with a vision and a goal of providing high-quality, wholesome popcorn with both honesty and integrity. Preferred Popcorn currently ships to over 70 countries around the world and supplies some of the biggest movie theater chains in America. Welcome, Mr. Krug. You may proceed with your opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Peters and Ranking Member Fisher, Chairman Cantwell, and Ranking Member Wicker. I truly mean that. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Norm Krug, and I'm the CEO of Preferred Popcorn, and I'm a farmer from Chapman, Nebraska. We grow corn, soybeans, and of course, we especially love growing popcorn. 23 years ago, and a mile and a half away from my house, there was a cleaning facility that was vacant. And it was my vision to reopen that facility and to provide opportunities for local farmers. I had hoped that we could start by selling our popcorn to Nebraska concessionaires and cinemas and stadiums, and then expand from there. But we were so good at producing popcorn that our very first year we grew 200 truckloads. So one of my first calls was to the University of Nebraska Athletic Department to see what their annual consumption was. Well, it turns out the whole university, and those of you who know we're from Nebraska, we all go there. It turns out that Nebraska uses 1 load per year. And even that load at that time was being donated. So my plan of opening a popcorn company to supply the needs of the state of Nebraska was not going to be big enough. While we struggled to gain name recognition and credibility with large domestic theater brands, we were growing rapidly in the global marketplace. Countries including Mexico, Thailand, Indonesia, China, India, Taiwan, we're all loving our American popcorn. And with the support of the Ex-Im Bank, we were able to ship to these countries without concern about receivables. Soon we were shipping to over 50 countries, and now, has been mentioned, 70. We were feeling quite confident in our future until COVID-19 came along, and like many small businesses, it dealt us a devastating blow. In the case of 2020, for the first time in history, nearly all the cinema industry was closed, not only in the United States, but in every country. We had bins full of popcorn, and our largest category of customers were shut down in an instant. But we're farmers, and farmers find a way to make it. Once again, exports were the key to our success. We were able to move dramatically into new markets, into the Middle East. But it was then, however, we started to see a shift in as our logistics team began informing me that the steamship line bookings were not coming back from our forwarders as quickly as they had in the past. For the next few months, we heard about the problems on the West Coast and the buildup of ships waiting to be unloaded. At the beginning of 21, we started to see large increases in wait times for steamship line bookings off the East Coast as well. So explaining the global freight crisis to our customers has now become part of our daily routine. Had these logistics not been obstacles, by October of this year, we would have shipped more than 900 additional containers to our customers who need our popcorn. And overall, this has equated to a loss of sales for Preferred Popcorn totaling more than $10 million. Of course, that means strained relationships with international partners and distributors that we have fought hard to maintain over these 23 years. And eventually, it's going to result in a higher cost to the consumer. We've heard from our forward partners that many containers that could be filled with American products are being returned across the ocean empty to be loaded again with goods coming into the United States. This practice confines our exports and limits new potential sales. Small businesses need these containers in the Midwest. I believe that given an equal opportunity, American farmers can compete with anyone in the world, and given an efficient container delivery system. I appreciate the opportunity to share our story, and I respectfully encourage the committee to provide the relief and assistance to the agricultural community at large who work tirelessly every day to feed the world. Thank you for this opportunity and look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you. Thank you for those comments. Any questions, Mr. Doyle? In your opening comments, you certainly painted a very challenging picture for you, your company, and all of your employees to get through what you are still working to get through, because we're not through this. But in your testimony, you talk about critical machine parts that were quoted with a 12-week lead time turned into 29-week delays before you finally received those parts. That is an incredible management challenge, and I understand you've still been able to maintain your deliveries, which certainly speaks well to what you're able to do. But my question to you is that I know you're committed to doing most of your manufacturing in the United States, your research and development, which is done in Rochester Hills. And as we look long-term on this challenge, because it'll continue to be a challenge going forward, could you speak to whether or not a good way to think about dealing with supply chain distributions from overseas is that we need to onshore more manufacturing here in the United States with American workers? Talk to me a little bit about that and how you would see that as something we should be thinking about as a policy direction.
Thank you for the question. I think that there's probably two thoughts that come to mind when that happens. One is the very personal one of our case about bringing a supply base onshore. We're a $50 million company, and our supplier of our principal material is a multi-billion-dollar company, so our chances of asking them to think about the optimization of their manufacturing on our behalf is a little silly. That having been said, we're exactly involved in that conversation with them. We have been working with them on their costs. We both know that the logistics costs are non-value added to either of our operations. They are looking at manufacturing locations in the United States that would shorten our supply chain from, instead of Greece, it would be actually a place in the Midwest, which would be great. So while I think our ability to affect that is limited, that I do believe that it's something we're pushing for, and we're trying to do that to optimize our operation, shorten our supply chains, which makes it easier to manage our operations, reduced inventories, those sorts of things all go with shorter supply chains. So absolutely, we're asking those questions. From the motor vehicles kind of point of view, there's 30,000 parts that go into the manufacture of a vehicle, and the nature in which the way the supply chains have been developed over the course of the 30 years that I've been involved in this, particularly when you look at the incredible expansion of manufacturing of vehicles in China and in Europe in some cases, a global supply chain developed, and the manufacturers optimize that down to the minute. You know, when we're late a minute to our customers, the consequences of that are fairly severe. Therefore, I think when you look at that, that's a much bigger kind of question. On a personal side, I think that we've discovered over the course of the last couple of years that there are certain supplies, commodities, services that we need to protect and be careful about. And I would absolutely support giving serious consideration to some of those things being balanced in supply base. I think a lot of us have learned about single source of supply and the risk that goes with that. Secondary sources in the United States and other friendly places, I would absolutely endorse.
Great. Well, thank you, Mr. Doyle. And I realize as one company, you can't affect all of those changes, but it's about policy and how we make sure that we're providing companies like yours and others the ability to have supply networks that are based in the United States with American workers and make the logistics a whole lot easier than what we're seeing right now, but more importantly, create jobs and opportunities for Americans. And I applaud what you already are doing. You're doing that every day, so thank you for what you're doing, and we want to be able to try to support those activities. Mr. Butler, throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, ocean carriers have reported record profits due to increasing the price of container shipments and increased demands for goods. Earlier this month, the Danish shipping company Maersk reported a net income of $17 billion. I understand it's their best quarter in more than 100 years. And we've seen an increase in container shipping pricing of 121% from just a year ago. Clearly, these record profits are good for the shipping industry, but have placed real challenges on businesses in Michigan, both large and small, as they try to deal with these increased shipping costs. We heard from Mr. Doyle what's going to happen later with his contract as a result of these large shipping costs. We've heard some testimony, and I've certainly heard from small suppliers in the automotive industry that these price increases are putting significant strain on those businesses. And large businesses like Leprino Foods, which operates 2 manufacturing facilities in Michigan, are being heavily impacted by current ocean shipping practices. Over 99% of Leprino's 2021 ocean shipments have been canceled, have been rebooked for a later date at least once, if not twice, and in some cases up to 10 times or more. And they've incurred millions of dollars in detention and demurrage fees on top of that. So my question for you, Mr. Butler, is what would you say to a company faced with the prospect of going out of business as a result of these exorbitant fees and practices? At the same time, ocean shippers are making record profits.
Well, thank you, Senator. As I said during my opening statement, we realize the conditions are difficult for folks all over the world, and got nothing but sympathy for people that are like Mr. Doyle's business who are dealing with those situations. The price situation right now is entirely unfamiliar to us. I mean, for the last 20 years, the ocean shipping business has been lucky to make its cost of capital. And what we're facing today is, you're absolutely correct. It's completely unprecedented, and it's purely the result of supply and demand in the market. A couple of things I would like to say about pricing. There are really 2 kinds of pricing in the industry. One is pricing under service contracts, which are long-term agreements between ocean carriers and their customers. Those rates have not gone up nearly as much as you hear with respect to these headline rates that often make it to the newspaper. The headline rates are in what's called the spot market, which is what it sounds like. It's you go out on tomorrow and ask what the rate is to move a box next week. And those are the rates where you're seeing the really eye-popping numbers. So one of the things we're seeing in the industry right now is a lot of our customers, shippers, really looking forward, wanting to make sure that they lock in capacity at a fixed rate under a service contract going forward. So that's just a little more background on that situation. The other piece with respect to pricing is that the ocean carriers that actually operate the ships are not the only actors in the market that price. There are far more middlemen, if you will, what they call non-vessel operating common carriers, or NVOCCs. Those folks buy space from our members and then resell it. And so that part of the market has also driven some of these pricing increases.
Thank you. Ranking Member Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome to all of our panelists today, and a special hello to Norm. I am so happy that you could join us, and thanks for taking the time to Zoom in for this hearing. In a normal year, Norm, how long would it take you to ship 1 container from your farm to an international partner?
Well, thank you. It's been commented previously. It's been that efficiency that's made it possible for us. Normally, from example, Chapman, Nebraska to Tokyo, Japan was 37 days. And that's pretty good when you think about the distance, and we're able to do that quite efficiently and land products around the world and be competitive. Currently, there's 2 issues. One is the actual transit time now would be 60 to 90 days to get that product shipped. But the bigger problem is that it takes 2 to 3 months to get space on the ship. So the booking time isn't where we used to put it in and request 10 containers, Japan, Tokyo, and then we get a response, and in 2 weeks, the containers would be here. So it's that 2 months combined with the 2 months of shipping time that is often putting us 4-5 months late from when the customer would longer than what we enjoyed in the past. The most extreme case, which is interesting and appreciate this opportunity to share, but would be where you have to remind everyone that popcorn, along with many other foods, are perishable. And so you ship a container and you think on the way it's going to take 37 days. And at 90 days in Japan recently, they just said, take that back. We don't want that popcorn. That popcorn had made it all the way to the coast, and they were concerned enough about quality that we had to return, as painful as that was, as you can imagine, those containers all the way back to Chapman to be unloaded and reclaimed and checked and all those things. So the problem gets amplified even more when you're talking about perishable goods. So yeah, long answer to your question, but has went from a pretty dependable 37 days to 4 to 5 months.
And your business isn't unique in this, right? I mean, I'm hearing from ag producers all across Nebraska, all across this country, who first of all are concerned that they can't get containers in order to even export their products. But then you add in the time involved, and as you said, these are perishable goods. It's affecting all parts of agriculture. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I definitely agree. Preferred Popcorn is just one of many, many companies that are impacted, and of course, a lot of cases there's even larger amounts of grain and other ag products that are not being shipped, and then those sales are often lost forever because, like all of us, the end consumer is going to look elsewhere to get their product if they're not able to get it from us.
And Norm, I'd like to ask you, and also Mr. Doyle, when you were looking at the shipping problems you're having now, a big part of that is cost. You know, you've alluded to that. So how much of your shipping costs gone up this year? We'll start with you first, Norm.
Yes, well, our actual freight costs are up about 30% from a year ago, which is hard enough. And then, of course, there's additional cost in storing the product longer. And then ultimately, we've had a lot of demurrage costs. And then you have to work that out with the customer, who's going to pay that and who follows that, when really it's neither. But to answer your question directly, our export costs are up about 30%.
And Mr. Doyle?
Ours is a rather unique situation, or unique to some of the others. We are actually not freight responsible. Therefore, our supplier provides it to our dock. The way it impacts us is that we have already begun negotiations with them for when our contract expires in April of 22, and they have informed us that we should be expecting a price increase of about 20 to 25%. They have told us that, and we know that the raw material underlying that cost has not substantially increased as a raw material. It is going to be the logistics question that is going to drive the increase in cost. So we're expecting 20 to 25%.
Okay. And one last question for Norm. When you've talked about being a farmer, and agriculture, of course, is very important for the state of Nebraska. You're talking about delays that you have in your business, but what about the delays in equipment, fertilizer? When you add in everything on these delays, how's that impacting not just you, but obviously the entire economy there, the farm economy?
Yeah, good question. Well, as you've probably heard, the input costs for 22 are very high. Our fertilizer prices are up not just percentage points, but about 3 times as well as the cost of our pesticides that all farmers use. The most interesting thing in this year's negotiations, as we're talking about next year's input costs, where the co-ops are actually telling us, yes, you should buy ahead, yes, you should lock the price in, and additionally, you should probably come and get it and have it stored on your farm because it's going to be such a tight supply. So in 21, farmers did have adequate pesticides and fertilizers to produce the crop. It appears it's going to be 22 that it will be very impactful in the cost of production for farmers in the Midwest. So I think we've only seen the beginning of the inflationary impact of these transportation issues. They're not going to go away. It's been stated already. Personally, I think it's going to increase more and more as we go into next year and the years following.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ranking Member Fisher. Senator Blumenthal, you are recognized for your questions.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Reagan, as you know, there have been a number of holds on Department of Transportation nominees. Do those have an impact on the ability to deal with supply chain delays?
Absolutely. Most of this would be dealt with under DOT jurisdiction, not being fully staffed up, not having full authority for those who are Senate confirmed positions that need to be in their jobs, including the FRA administrator, for example. That is going to impact our ability to respond in an effective way.
And those holds are Republican holds on nominees to the DOT?
That is my understanding, yes.
What do you think are the sources of the workforce shortage?
To me, it's not a workforce shortage so much as it is a quality of jobs problem and a pay shortage. Certainly in the trucking industry, where you see misclassification, owner-operated truckers that see, oftentimes they're leasing their vessels, they're only paid for when they hold the cargo, they're waiting in hours-long lines, and they have to pay their own benefits and their own overhead on top of that, and that's not a very attractive job. That's the reason we see 90% turnover in that industry. And similarly on the rail side, these have been historically the types of jobs that people work for their entire career and retire under. And we're seeing mid-career employees walking away from a secure retirement because oftentimes the pressure that's put on, based again on stock returns and other sort of profitability, are making them less attractive, including the threat of furloughs, the pressure to get inspections done earlier, the safety concerns that many people have, and that is, again, these aren't people that are walking away. So that they've been doing those jobs, and now they're no longer doing them.
So it's really a quality of work rather than a workforce shortage.
Yes.
Is the issue.
Yes, indeed.
What about skill training? Could employers attract more workers by providing more skill training?
Yes, I think certainly from a rail perspective, the type of training and also engaging their unions, because this is a highly unionized industry, to make sure that we bring in skilled employees and making sure that we're stressing that these are safe jobs that are going to provide good benefits. That is an important part of retaining and attracting skilled workers.
Do you think that with these changes in the quality of work and more skill training, we can meet what people commonly call the workforce shortage, but really not a shortage of people willing to work, it's the other factors that go along with the workplace?
Yes, I think that this is something that we can address. Certainly, again, there's sort of separate issues between some of the railroad and the trucking side of this. On the trucking side, it is our contention that misclassification of these workers, disconnecting people from their employer, making these less attractive jobs is a key part for why there's such high turnover rate and why we're having so much difficulty attracting people to do that work. On the rail side, this was once, the type of career that people would do for their entire careers. And making sure that we're addressing some of the movement of the industry towards the sort of hedge fund managed style and away from the consistent, sustainable operations that we require of our freight network would bring us back to the type of jobs that, frankly, most of the people that I know in the railroad industry think of very fondly and are very proud of.
Thank you. Mr. Krug, talking about the popcorn business, is popcorn, as you manufacture and ship it, a perishable item?
It is. Thank you, Senator, for the question. It has a long perishable time and is stored properly our normal expiration dates are 18 months, but it is perishable, and it's, of course, very dependent on the conditions. If it's stored in high humidity, then it would last, of course, only a short time. It could mold in a month if the conditions aren't correct. So it is perishable, but we're fortunate it has a long perishable time if the conditions are good.
Do you tell shippers about conditions that you recommend for it to be transported?
Yes. Of course, we communicate that in all of our documents that are required for shipping and with our customers as well. And so we do the best we can to communicate that information.
How has the pandemic affected the popcorn business, if I may ask?
Yeah, well, it's been very difficult. As I stated earlier, you couldn't really imagine anything that could come around and shut down every theater, every cinema, every stadium, not only in America, but in the world. There has been some counter to that as there's been increased grocery sales of the product line, and that's been helpful to offset some of the loss that we've had in exports and in bulk consumption. There's been increases in the ready-to-eat market and in the microwave business, and that part has been helpful to offset the total picture.
I'm a big popcorn fan, so I wish you well. I'm especially a fan of Nebraska popcorn.
Great.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. We'll now recognize the full committee's ranking member, Senator Wicker.
Thank you very much, Senator. Mr. Butler, let me ask you about a statement you made. Certain legislation could actually have the opposite effect. And I think you and I agree on that. Let's try to be specific, though. On the Freight Act, the legislation would spur improvements to our freight transportation system. That would not be unhelpful, correct? That's not one of the things you're talking about, right?
That's correct, Senator. I think the things that are systemic in terms of building up infrastructure and improving information flow and that sort of thing is all to the good. I was referring to amendments to the Shipping Act, some of which I think would be detrimental.
Okay, well, specifically tell us what not to do.
Okay, well, for example, in the House bill that's being considered probably this week, just as an example of the conflicting signals that I was talking about in my opening statement. There's one provision in that bill that says you have to, as a carrier, you have to provide adequate equipment to everybody who wants to ship. The next provision says you have to put exports on the ship before you can put any empty containers for repositioning on the ship. Now, as I said earlier, in normal times, we can balance that even though we have a 2-to-1 imbalance of imports to exports. We can work around that. But in times of scarcity, it becomes very difficult, and those some of the things we've talked about here today.
Okay, well, perhaps our colleagues in the House will help us by making good decisions over there. What about streamlining the certification process for truck drivers?
That's not in the legislation that I'm speaking of.
Okay,
I'd leave that
well,
to the trucking
so
community.
it's in the Freight Act, but would that be helpful, streamlining the certification process for truck drivers?
I would defer to my colleagues in the trucking industry, but if it maintains safety and brings people on more quickly that want to work, I can't see how it could hurt.
Okay, I said, well, let's talk about demurrage and detention. Now, detention is when the product doesn't get there soon enough. And demurrage fines, demurrage fees are when the shipper doesn't come and pick it up from the port quick enough. Detention and demurrage. And are we sort of, when somebody talks about dwell fees, does that term describe both detention and demurrage?
So the term dwell fee has come into use with these fees that have been proposed but not yet charged on the West Coast. And I would say those are essentially demurrage fees. Those are fees that would be imposed if you don't pick up the cargo soon enough.
Okay, right. Well, are demurrage fees adding to the cost of goods? And are they being charged to companies and shippers who, through no fault of their own, are unable to comply? And is that a problem? And if so, is there a solution?
Well, there's no one answer to that question, but I'll say a couple of things. With both detention and demurrage, there has to be a balance. The Federal Maritime Commission has recognized that these fees are a critical incentive to get people to either pick up their cargo from the port and get it out of there, or to bring back the empty equipment.
Is it helping right now, Mr. Butler, with everything else that's causing the supply chain delay?
In many cases, it is helping. It does help because it does provide an incentive for people to keep that equipment moving. Part of the problem is, and again, I'm trying to point fingers, and somebody else mentioned this earlier, everyone's trying to optimize their little piece of the supply chain, right? And if you've got a full warehouse and you've got more product coming in that you've ordered from overseas, you've got no place to put it, if you could leave it on the port for free, you're going to leave it on the port for free, even if it's going to gum up that same supply chain.
Let me ask you quickly, Mr. Butler. Were you surprised at the information I gave to the committee about a different queuing system, a different counting system? Is that information that I alluded to from the Bloomberg article correct? We actually got more ships there, longer waiting times, they're just counting them different.
I don't know if they're counting them differently. That was a voluntary program that was set up between the industry, the Coast Guard, and the Marine Exchange off of Southern California. We had too many ships too close together and too close to shore with winter weather coming on. There was concern about safety, and so
okay, but if they're loitering out for whatever reason, but slowing their speed, to say that those ships are not part of the supply chain delay is a little inaccurate. So thank you for that. Let me just ask briefly, Mr. Krug. Mr. Krug, that 90-day-old popcorn that was still probably okay, I hope you're able to send that somewhere.
Yeah, we're able to check that over and recondition it, and we were able to reuse that product. So it's just an ongoing complication that probably you don't think of when you say there's delays in shipments. All has been testified here today, the problem just grows and grows, and we've all the more reason to do all we can. I again appreciate your meeting to work on that today to keep the amazing system that we've had in the past moving. It's best for agriculture and best for small business.
Well, thank you.
And
I wish you well. And I was just going to offer to take some of that popcorn because I'm with Senator Blumenthal in support of popcorn, and with some relatives in Nebraska, I'm sure it's among the finest. I yield back and thank the chair for his indulgence.
Thank you, Ranking Member Wicker. Senator Baldwin, you are recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Shortages in shipping containers, chassis, and truck trailers have all contributed to the supply chain problems that are the subject of this particular hearing. And I've seen media reports that describe these newly in-demand items as simple or an afterthought. In Wisconsin, however, we know that these products are actually highly engineered by companies like Stoughton Trailers, and the work of Wisconsin manufacturers is never an afterthought for me. What is overlooked is the decline of our manufacturing capacity, which has left us unprepared to respond to many of the problems that are created by pandemic. So in order to rebuild our manufacturing base and make products that we need for our supply chains right here in the United States, I've introduced the Supply Chain Resiliency Act. That legislation, which was referred to this committee, provides assistance to address supply chain bottlenecks by increasing production, domestic production. And I'm working to ensure that similar support is included in our Build Back Better legislation. So, Mr. Regan, in your view, how would increasing the domestic production of things like containers and chassis and trailers improve our supply chain bottlenecks? I guess reduce our supply chain bottlenecks would be a better way to put that. And what sort of emphasis should we be putting on Buy America and Make It in America?
Well, thank you, Senator, and thank you for your unwavering support for U.S. manufacturing and the good union jobs that it supports. I think you've really hit the nail on the head here. I mean, the fact that we are so reliant on foreign products, including chassis and other parts of the supply chain, and rail cars for that matter, really made us much more susceptible to failing when something like this happens, when we have a crisis. Increasing our domestic manufacturing capacity should be a priority for this Congress and for this administration. I know that it is for many of you. And also, as we start to see more emerging opportunities with new technology, things like electric vehicles and things like that, those are emerging markets. And we have an opportunity with the right type of investment and the right type of policies to make sure that the U.S. is getting an important part of that supply chain and that market share for manufacturing.
Thank you. I'm going to stick with you with this next question. I've been long concerned about rail service and competition. And these supply chain challenges underscore the need for structural changes for freight rail. At the Surface Transportation Board, Chair Marty Oberman has raised concerns about the significant impact that job cuts have had on the railroads. I know we've already been discussing that, about their ability to serve their customers and move goods across the country. Since 2014, the industry has cut about 30% of its workforce. And I introduced an amendment, as you gave it a shout out, to the NDAA that would direct the STB to develop standards and guidance related to their common carrier obligations. And in so doing, require the STB to consider workforce reductions and infrastructure maintenance by railroads. So now more than ever, the railroads really should be focused on their workers and shippers, not just shareholders. What do you see as the impact of these job cuts specifically on the ability of railroads to be able to provide reasonable service and, again, meet their common carrier requirements?
Thank you, and we talk a lot about this in our written as well. About precision scheduled railroading is what we like to call it. It's put a lot more of the onus on the shippers themselves. There's a lot reduced flexibility because of the sharp decrease in workforces and also in equipment. There's been a lot of mothballing of rail cars and closing of rail yards. So what shippers end up with is a take it or leave it approach. So it's essentially, can I reach this car and ship my goods, or am I going to have to try to catch the next train or use another mode of transportation? And oftentimes that alternative is far more expensive. I've spoken with Mr. Oberman quite a bit about this, and he does need the tools and the authority to be able to really look into it and investigate it and oversee to ensure that these railroads are fulfilling their common carrier obligations.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Baldwin. Senator Tester, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a great committee. We've got folks from the World Shipping Council and the American Federation of Labor. Mr. Doyle, do you deal in cars or car parts? Parts? That's a good thing, because we like to redo cars on the farm, and we also like to eat popcorn. So here we go. I'm just a couple months away from starting our 45th year on our family farm. And so we've seen a lot of increases of inputs. And I hate to say every time, but I'm going to say every time we see a bump in prices, we see a bump in the cost of inputs. And this is for you, Mr. Krug. How much of the increased price in fertilizer and chemical that we talked about, and I've heard the same statistics you have, and I believe them to be true, but how much of that increased cost actually has to do with shipping? Do you know?
I don't have any exact numbers on that, but I'm sure it's a combination of input costs. Fuel is one of those. And as been mentioned earlier, it's also a market, and as soon as demand is high, there often seems to be an increase in prices. As far as the products that we produce, the popcorn, there isn't a supply shortage. We're able to tell our customers we have the product. But it will be a big deal next year. You're correct. Sounds like we're both in farming, and it's challenging to see how we're going to afford those increase in inputs. And I don't have a good answer on why it's such a big increase, but I know that it is.
I have my own thoughts on it, and it has a lot to do with lack of competition in the industry, I believe, but time will tell that out. This is for you, Mr. Butler. The statistics I've seen is that we're losing potential of about 22% of our exports, our ag exports, because of the lack of shipping ability. I didn't get here at the very beginning, but one of you, and I think it might have been you, said we got more coming in, imports, than we got going out. It would seem to me that that would mean that exports have an advantage in this system because there's both boats and containers to take care of those exports. Can you tell me why it isn't happening? And if you want to add in why taking empty containers back when we're losing 22% of our exports is something that we should accept.
Thank you, Senator. On the 22%, my understanding is that number comes from a poll that the Agricultural Transportation Coalition did. We've never seen that poll, so I can't really speak to the legitimacy of that number. But we do know this. We know that both importers and exporters are having trouble moving their goods efficiently. So there's no question about the nature of the problem. In terms of the space in and out, and I did refer to this a little bit earlier, in normal times, pardon me, in normal times, we're about 2-to-1 imports to exports, right? So you always have to reposition some empties. During this import surge, particularly in Southern California, we've gone up 3-to-1 or more. So the big problem is really the imbalance.
Yeah.
And it's keeping everything moving so you can get it to the next person. In the case of your question, a U.S. exporter. And then once they get that container, a lot of their fight is getting it to the port so we can put it on a ship.
Yeah, and there's money in the bipartisan infrastructure package to do some things with shipping and do some things with rails that I look forward to get out the door. I do agree with Mr. Reagan that we have an opportunity here to start manufacturing more stuff in this country, and my good friend Senator Baldwin, because quite frankly, this is kind of silly. I mean, truthfully, that we're depending upon other countries for stuff we can do right here, and we might say, well, you know, it costs too much to build it here, but it's costing us a lot with the supply chain stuff, and so it's really important. So I've got a question for you, Mr. Doyle, simply because you're in the automotive business, and my son actually likes to fix up old cars. If you were king for a day, what would you do to solve this problem?
I suppose retire is not an acceptable answer.
You would retire immediately, is that what you said?
I think that we've got long-term and short-term issues. I've joked with my peers, having read through a lot of the bills and acts that are out there, that one of the things that I've seen is that you're pretty clever at naming these bills. I like the Grinch Act and things like that. In the short term, I've joked about the idea, I'd like to see the Dunkirk Act, everybody with a boat, go out and pick up something and bring it to shore and let's get things rolling. And I know that that's in jest, but it gets at the question of urgency, and it gets at the question of creativity to solve this problem. What I have to do every day is look at my employees and talk to them about wages and unemployment issues and lower bonuses and less opportunity for training. And why is that? Well, part of it's because there is this backup in the system. And I will defer to the two gentlemen to my right as experts on why and how that's occurring. But if I were king for a day, first thing I would do would be I would create a sense of urgency by getting these things done. Okay? I don't know what the answers are. I think there's a lot of good stuff in the Freight Act that gets at this. I've seen a lot of the bills that I think a lot of really good thinking is being done. I would ask for urgency. The second thing, if I were king for today, is I think that there's an awful lot of that's also being talked about that's fundamentally addressing the needs for us to upgrade our infrastructure to support manufacturing for the long term. I think that the infrastructure bill gets at a lot of those things. There's money out there for roads and bridges, and it looks like you're electrifying everything from vehicles down to tricycles, all very cool stuff. And so I think that that's on the right path as well. King for a day, I'd get after this thing with a sense of urgency.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Tester. Senator Scott, you are recognized for your questions.
First, I want to thank Chair Peters and Ranking Member Fisher for hosting this hearing today. As President Biden continues to push failed policies and unconstitutional vaccine mandates, the United States is facing a major supply chain crisis. The higher prices and product shortages caused by this crisis are hurting families like poor families that are struggling every day to make ends meet, and our small businesses in my state, I know all across the nation. Around my state, what they're seeing shelves not stocked with everyday items, and it's an everyday challenge to get the goods on the shelves. So what we've seen is, instead of creating a friendly business environment to help rebound from the pandemic, President Biden has made a priority of his administration to add burdensome regulations that have stifled economic growth. When I was governor of Florida, what I saw is it's not just cutting taxes, it's reducing regulations, streamlining the permitting process to help you get more jobs. We have 15 seaports in my state, and what we're seeing around the country is American ports are experiencing severe cargo delays as we head into the holiday season. We're also seeing inflation now is the worst it's been in 30 years. And as I talk to many manufacturers, are seeing double-digit cost increases, and that's going to get passed on over the next year or two to customers. I find what I've watched is, instead of the Secretary of Transportation and the Secretary of Commerce going on and figuring out how to solve a problem, what I'm seeing is they go on TV and they're great commentators about what the problem is, but they don't solve it. I've requested an oversight hearing in this committee to address the current supply chain crisis. I've called for Secretary of Transportation Buttigieg and Secretary of Commerce Raimondo to testify about what their plans are. When I was governor of Florida, when we had a problem, we got on a plane, we went down to the city, and we sat there and solved the problem. And what we're seeing right now with those two secretaries is, I see them on TV, but I've not seen one of them go to the port in Long Beach and done squat. That's not what you do if you get elected or you get appointed to these positions. So I want to thank Chair Peters and Ranking Member Fisher for hosting this meeting, and I'm encouraging Chair Cantwell to urge Secretary Buttigieg and Secretary Raimondo to share their solutions. I don't know why they wouldn't want to come and share their solutions and have shown what they're going to do to solve these problems. But in the meantime, I'm going to hold all the nominations to the Department of Transportation and Commerce until that happens. I think the American public deserves it, and I think it's wrong that they won't come here and tell us what they're doing to fix it. So my first question is for Mr. Butler. So as the CEO of World Shipping Council, what would you say? Would you say the Department of Transportation has a pretty significant impact on shipping and the overall supply chain?
Senator, the fact of the matter is that whether it's the Department of Transportation or any other part of the government, there is a limited number of things that government can do to unwind this situation. There's been a lot of talk today about some of the infrastructure investments, and in the long term, those are absolutely critical. But in terms of the short-term situation that we're facing today with this import surge that's really just saturated the supply chain from end to end, it's going to be commercial actors the folks that run that supply chain, that unwind that thing. We appreciate all the help we can get, but in the end, it's our job.
So we had, when I had a hurricane, some days we were selling 9 times as much gas in one day. And for a week before a hurricane, we sell multiples. And what we did is we sat down, we organized, and we sat down with every level, every player all along, and we streamlined the process. We waived regulations. We had Highway Patrol help move the trucks to get the gas out. And I've not seen one thing like that out of this administration. And so I don't believe that it's going to be run by government, but that clearly government could have an impact by just helping move the process along and getting everybody together and talk about it, because you have to be able to streamline this. And I haven't seen them do it one time. So Mr. King and Mr. Doyle, what do you guys employ, how many jobs each of you have?
We have about 80 positions in the United States, and we have a small company in Mexico where we have about 50 employees.
How many non-essential workers? How many non-essential workers do you guys have?
Probably 0. They're all pretty essential, and we've been fortunate to keep all of them throughout all of this. And in a lot of ways, the system has worked quite good. The PPP was very helpful, and we stayed open through all of the pandemic, and we have not let anyone go. We need all of them. They're all essential.
How about you? Any non-essential? So when you hear these regulations that come out that you got to treat these non-essential workers somehow, differently, does that make any sense to you?
If you're talking to me, no. As far as Nebraska, the unemployment rate is quite low, and I think we want to continue to encourage hardworking Americans and reward them. And that's so that, there's a great need for work, and we're grateful for a great workforce that we have, but certainly need to continue to encourage them and reward those that are working.
Yeah, I would completely concur with what was just said. Our issue isn't unessential workers. Our issue is not having enough workers at the moment. We have what I would consider an outstanding company culture. I think we address a lot of the questions of wages, training and development, excellent leadership throughout the facility, and my biggest concern is that we need to focus on growing employment and focusing on the things that will continue to attract people to us as their best option as a place to work, because through our work, they can provide for their families and they can provide for their personal and professional development. That's our focus on employment.
Thanks for being here. Thank you, Chair Peters. Thank Ranking Member Fisher.
Thank you, Senator Scott. Senator Warnock, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you so very much, Chair Peters. Whether it's parents shopping for groceries and holiday presents, or businesses trying to deliver for their customers, we've all felt the effects of the current supply chain disruptions. And that's why I convened a roundtable last month with Georgians representing the Ports Authority, workers, freight transportation, local small businesses, and big international companies to learn more about the challenges they're facing and to discuss the solutions that they're already implementing. And after that roundtable and many conversations with the White House Supply Chain Disruptions Task Force and the Georgia Ports Authority, we were able to secure $8 million to help alleviate congestion at the Port of Savannah. With these funds, the Georgia Ports Authority is able to partner with railroads to convert existing inland facilities into pop-up container yards. Mr. Regan, I know from your testimony that you are quite familiar with what the Georgia Ports Authority is doing. Could you elaborate on how investing in these pop-up facilities will help relieve dockside congestion and move vessels in and out of ports more quickly, especially when we see these big spikes in container traffic?
Certainly, Senator, and while we know that all the challenges at LA Long Beach have gotten a lot of the headlines, we know that there are a lot of problems in Savannah as well. But these pop-up shops, again, as Mr. Doyle or Mr. Butler mentioned, one of the problems is there's no place to put these containers. So the pop-up areas will allow you to have more areas to put containers so we can start moving them out more quickly. And this is actually an example of an area where the Biden administration has actually provided more flexibility for port operators to be able to use allocated money for more flexible purposes to alleviate the problems that are existing in the supply chain right now. So this is an example where the Biden administration has acted to alleviate, to provide more flexibility and more of an ability for operators to address the problem that they're seeing right now.
Thank you so much. I think these pop-up facilities are a part of the solution, and we're already seeing declines in vessel backlog, dwell time, truck turn times. As a native of Savannah, Georgia, I'm very proud of the port in Savannah, and we want to make sure that we provide capacity so that the port can address the current supply chain issues. Mr. Butler, in your testimony, you mentioned the lack of landside capacity at U.S. ports as one of the causes for the congestion that we're seeing. Do you think increased federal investments in port and multimodal freight infrastructure will help ease congestion and build up that necessary capacity to handle increased ocean shipping traffic long-term?
Senator, long-term, it's absolutely has to be beneficial to have that increased investment. There's no question about it.
Can you say more about that?
Well, you asked your question in terms of long-term, and I think that's appropriate. And this goes a little bit to something I said to Senator Scott, that the short-term is really an operational situation that we all have to work together throughout the supply chain to try to solve. And it's every handoff from the ship to the port, from the port to the railroad, to the warehouse. All of that is saturated. So we have to work through all of that. But having said that, for the long term, if each of those points in the supply chain is more robust from better investment, then it all works better, right, when you get pushed with a situation of congestion like we have today.
These investments, as you point out, are critical, and that's why I was proud to support Georgia Port Authority's successful infra grant application for nearly $47 million to build the Northeast Georgia Inland Port in Hall County. And that's one reason I push for increased funding for port projects and multimodal grant projects in the bipartisan infrastructure package. I look forward to working with you, with the administration, to get these investments out to Georgia as soon as possible. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Senator Warnock. Senator Thune, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Chairman Peters and Ranking Member Fisher, and thanks to all the witnesses for being here today. It's already been pointed out, we all know that the country's facing an unprecedented supply chain crisis, with Americans encountering empty store shelves, long wait times, and rising costs as the holiday season approaches. Agricultural producers are also feeling the crunch, with capacity for their goods being hampered by a combination of surging demand for containerized shipping and a massive backlog at our nation's ports, particularly LA Long Beach. This inefficiency has downstream effects on commodity prices, which is hurting farmers and ranchers across the country, including in my state of South Dakota. And that is why Senator Klobuchar and I, along together with Senators Hoeven and Baldwin, plan to introduce the Senate companion to the Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2021, which takes significant steps to clarify the authority of the Federal Maritime Commission in resolving disputes and curbing anti-competitive behavior. I believe these changes will increase the accessibility of the FMC to smaller shippers and provide the agency with clearer authority to intervene when unreasonable practices related to the movement of cargo are discovered. More generally, our nation's ports are desperately in need of two things: modernization in transparency. And a failure to invest in terminal automation and port efficiency initiatives such as data sharing compounds the problems we are already facing today and puts the United States below the global average in vessel wait times, which is why I'm also proud to be a co-sponsor of Ranking Member Wicker's Freight Act, which takes strong actions to improve the movement of freight, I should say, across the supply chain. A resolution of this crisis is imperative, and I look forward to discussing this matter with our witnesses today. Mr. Krug, thank you for being here to testify today virtually about the supply chain challenges that your business has faced throughout the pandemic. I've heard from several businesses like yours and can certainly understand the frustration of losing hard-won business across the world due to circumstances that are entirely out of your hands. As I previously mentioned, the bill that I plan to introduce with Senator Klobuchar would provide the FMC with authority to pursue enforcement action if truly unjust or unreasonable practices related to vessel space accommodations were discovered. Do you believe that such a change would help address the challenges that you're facing in getting your products to markets across the world?
Yeah, that certainly sounds positive and helpful, and we appreciate all of your efforts in that regard. And so yes, the answer would be yes. I think that'd be very, very beneficial. I did have one more idea in regard to that opportunity if I were king for a day. I was just thinking about that. I think I'd order everyone to go to the movies and buy 2 boxes of popcorn.
Okay. Well, I don't think you'd have any opposition to that idea on this committee, at least not from this senator. You mentioned in your testimony the difficulty you face in getting containers inland, and I'm just wondering if you have any suggestions for what Congress can do to ease the movement of containers once they leave the ports.
Once they leave the ports?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing there is good communication from the shippers to us. One of the big costs would be if we plan on 10 containers coming and then our good forwarding companies are only able to ship out 2. So the better the communication is in regard to, no, this ship really is going to not come in, it's not going to be available, it will be 3 weeks. While that doesn't really solve the problem in the big picture, it does help reduce demurrage charges and warehouse that are overfilled because you're expecting to ship 10 and you get 2 containers.
So
that would be one point.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Doyle, you mentioned in your testimony the effects of demurrage charges on the price of your products and called for an increase in the enforcement capabilities of the FMC with respect to detention and demurrage charges. And the bill, as I mentioned, I plan to introduce with Senator Klobuchar, would require the FMC to further define what constitutes unreasonable detention and demurrage practices while also establishing a separate streamlined complaint process to more efficiently resolve disputes. Do you believe that improvements to the complaint process and better guidance from the regulator on what constitutes an unreasonable detention or demurrage charge will help to address the challenges that you're facing?
As I mentioned at the beginning, since our contracts do not have us as freight responsible, we see the end of this, but not the causes of it. Everything you've said sounds logical, but I would certainly defer to the people who are wrestling with the issues. I don't understand the current condition well enough to, I think, give a reasonable answer to your question.
Mr. Butler, can you react to that?
Senator, I think having better dispute resolution mechanisms probably would benefit everybody. There's some other provisions, if I understand the bill correctly, that would like to work with you and your staff on having to do with certification, for example. There's some real problems with how that would work. But in general, the FMC has a lot of authority today. If we can make it quicker and easier to get disputes resolved, I think that's all to the good.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Thune. Now, the votes have been called, so I'm going to be stepping out to vote. Ranking Member Fisher will take the gavel, but before I step out, Senator Klobuchar, you're recognized for your questions.
Very good. Thank you very much, Chairman Peters, Senator Fisher, for your work. As Senator Thune noted, we have to take action here. agricultural exports, and we both are in major, all three of us here, major ag producing states, very important export for our country in so many ways. And ag exports have been particularly hard hit by increased costs and transportation challenge. I think one of our problems here is, yes, we have supply chain problems. We all know that. We all know there's multiple answers, improving the infrastructure, what's going on in the shipping industry, a workforce, everything from training people to go into the jobs that we have available now, to wages, to making sure that we do immigration reform and get some more workers into certain industries. So, but the problem is it's not the same size fits all. At the start of the pandemic, Minnesota ag producers saw a 47% decline in exports, and in the last 2 years, ag exporters have lost 22% of sales. Meanwhile, ocean carriers have reported record profits from the increased demand for imported goods and higher price for container shipments. And so that's what we're dealing with here, and that's when you step in, because we want the economy to work for everyone, and especially, obviously, for our constituents and those that are feeding the world. Mr. Krug, in your testimony, you note how your company is losing its ability to compete in the global market due to challenges moving freight. Do you agree that FMC needs to do more to protect competition?
Yeah, so we certainly, it's normal market, this competition that takes place. If you're unable to deliver or ship, that end customer is going to get that product from some other part of the world.
Exactly.
In the case of popcorn, with Argentina and Brazil, and so if we're not able to deliver, they're not going to say, well, we understand, we'll wait. They're going to try to find that product as competition normally works. They're going to find somewhere else to buy it. So that's where this becomes really important. I appreciate your understanding of that. You're doing a good job.
Well, thank you. Unsolicited, remote, but unsolicited. Mr. Reagan, it currently costs 7 times more to ship and export from California to China than to ship that same product from China to California. Can you speak to some of the challenges with moving freight on land, particularly with transporting empty containers?
Sure. And we discussed a little bit of this earlier in terms of
also
having our ability to manufacture them here and develop our own capacity to be able to meet some of the challenges we're seeing here in terms of container supply. And I also want to comment that we also agree with the comments the Federal Maritime Commission needs to have the authority to investigate and oversee the statutory requirements that are put in place by that agency.
Good. Thank you very much. Maybe you can take this one as well. The Port of Duluth is the largest and busiest port of the Great Lakes, with 800 vessels and an average of 35 million tons of cargo per year. Minnesota, however, has deferred building a portion of the Twin Ports interchange, a project to replace aging infrastructure and better accommodate freight access because of construction costs. Mr. Reagan, in your testimony, you note how the Port of Savannah is using inland ports to hold overflow containers. How important are our inland ports in relieving some of the congestion from the coastal areas?
They are extremely important. And I think the other thing that we often find right now in terms of the lack of development in some of these major port issues is, frankly, funding. Funding is a big problem in terms of pursuing whether it be more inland port, but also more intermodal facilities. And we've discussed the lack of rail connectivity as one of the major problems, but 60% of ports say that funding is their number one hurdle towards addressing some of these problems. So we're very positive about the $2.2 billion in the bipartisan bill towards the Port Infrastructure Development Act, and that is really going to go a long way towards the long-term solutions for this.
Agree. From a Duluth, Minnesota perspective, agree. Mr. Krug, this will be my last question. While small and medium-sized enterprises account for 98% of U.S. exporters, rural businesses are often located far from transportation hubs, making it difficult for them to access international markets. Senator Hoeven and I have introduced a Promoting Rural Exports Act. It actually makes permanent what has been a very successful effort to have a set group of people working on rural exports and giving rural businesses the expertise they need. And this is based on our experience both in North Dakota and Minnesota. Could you talk about the importance of rural businesses having increased access to foreign markets and how it's not the same as a multinational corporation, many of them also located in my state, who can employ full-time trade experts in different regions of the world?
Sure. Well, yeah, transportation obviously is key. We started out just a few years ago, and we put a paved road that's only 1.2 miles long to get to the highway. But that 1 mile opened up the world, and that ability to be able to reliably ship containers each day was a big step, and the state of Nebraska was supportive of that. And so anything that can be done to improve transportation and ability to get these ag products to the marketplace is huge. And there's the rail, of course, is important to that. That was some of the issues that have happened too. So
The captive
communication.
customers, yep. Okay.
The rail.
Good. I see some of my colleagues are here, so I've overdone my questions here. So I want to thank you very much, all of you. Thanks.
Thank you, Senator Klobuchar. Senator Lummis.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. My first question is for Mr. Butler. Are there any regulatory barriers facing the carriers from operating additional sweeper ships that would help alleviate the excess container capacity at the ports?
Senator, today the answer is no, and that's one of the things that our members are doing to try to clear out some of the empties that have piled up that are getting in the way of everybody being able to move their cargo. It's a good question, though, in the context of some of the legislation that's out there, because there are provisions both in the new Senate bill and in the House bill that would essentially say you have to load all export containers before you can take any empties. And it doesn't work that way. We have to keep both moving, and if we get too restrictive about how we operate our networks, then it's going to make it worse for everybody.
Follow up on that with regard to transparency of data. I know Congress has passed several laws relating to data transparency for how ports are operating, but would additional transparency mechanisms needed for port operations, would they help with that? Could they help the communication between empties and offloading and all of what seems to be jamming up some of the ports right now?
There's no question that better communication can only improve the fluidity in the system, and that's something that really every private sector actor within the supply chain is working on today. In a place like LA Long Beach, where you've got so many terminal operators, so many carriers, so many trucking companies, it's a tremendously complex thing.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure how big the role is, for example, for the federal government in that, but it's absolutely something that is part of the solution.
So how do the private sector providers of coordinate the communications?
Well, so there's probably a different answer for every port, every terminal operator, every carrier, but in broad scope, I mean, the ocean carriers communicate with the terminals that they're going to call while the ship is still at sea. Say, this is when we want to come in, this is what we have on board, and they begin communicating with the inland transportation providers, the railroads, et cetera. So there's a tremendous amount that goes on today. I mean, sometimes when you hear this debate, you would get the impression that nobody's talking to anybody, and that's not true, because if that were the case, we wouldn't be able to move the tremendous amounts of cargo that we move. But having said that, the cargo volumes keep going up, the challenges get more and more complex, and so we have to improve our communications and information sharing to match that.
So there's no role for the federal government in that, correct?
Well, I would never say never. You don't want to say there's no role. There may be some roles in terms of encouraging the exchange of information, but if you're asking me, should there be some federal system to handle all that, I think from our industry standpoint, we would prefer, if you will, to keep that in-house.
Yep, okay, thank you. With regard to the lack of available storage space for containers coming off the ocean carriers, earlier this fall, I wrote a letter to President Biden outlining several actions his administration could take to help alleviate some of the supply chain issues we're currently seeing. And one of the recommendations was to explore using federal properties for temporary storage for excess containers. Do you believe that's a viable option?
Senator, storage off the ports is something that I think everybody is looking into today. Whether a particular piece of property will work depends on its location, whether it can be secured, whether you can get equipment there.
Yep.
But if we have empty federal properties that meet those criteria, then that's something we should be looking at.
Well, I noted, and I turn this to Mr. Regan, when the gentleman from Georgia was here, he alluded to some of these pop-up storage sites. And Mr. Regan, in your written testimony, you mentioned how the Port of Savannah used federal funds to create off-site overflow container storage areas. What has been the impact for that specific port? And is it an idea that should be expanded to other ports?
Sure. The impact has been to remove some of the bottleneck that is existing at that port. So you're moving some of the containers away from where the offloading is happening, away from the intermodal facilities, and you're creating more of a fluidity at the port. And the reason why that was appropriate in that case was the operator of the Port of Savannah had leftover money from previous federal grants, and they were given the flexibility to be able to use it to address the problem as they saw fit. That may be the best solution in other ports. They may want to use excess money or use federal grants for other purposes, because I think the problems are different at each place, but the flexibility is a key part there, and I think that's a really important part of the way that the administration has addressed this problem.
Well, you sense the frustration of the committee and trying to understand what the role of Congress might be in these issues. I've heard you compliment some of the provisions of the bipartisan infrastructure bill. So I'm hopeful that that can begin to address some of the issues we're discussing today. And I encourage you, when you have other thoughts about how we can help alleviate this problem, we would be grateful for your thoughts. And thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Senator Lummis. We are joined by the chair of the Full Commerce Committee, Senator Cantwell. You're recognized for your
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you and Senator Fisher for both being stalwarts in getting this hearing done. I think this is the third hearing we've had on supply chain, so we very much appreciate it and appreciate all the witnesses being here today to talk about this important issue. I don't know if any of you caught Fareed Zakaria's discussion a couple of weeks ago about supply chain and the Infrastructure Investment Act. I thought it was great, and I'll submit this to the record if I can.
Without objection.
But basically, he was talking about the percentage of infrastructure investment as it relates to GDP and how we had fallen off getting to less than 1% down to 0.7%, but obviously with the infrastructure bill by 2026, we'd get up to 1.3%. So while we're dealing with these phenomenons that Mr. Butler adequately describes in his opening statement about the impacts of being able to order more and import more and the challenges of COVID, we also have to keep in mind that we have to make significant infrastructure investments. So I think you would all agree that that was a good thing that we made these infrastructure investments, and now that we have to get them actually implemented. Is that correct? That you think that this helps immensely in changing the picture here?
Yes, absolutely.
No argument.
Okay, so now we're talking about new patterns in addition to this very historic pattern of underinvesting in infrastructure. And I say this coming from a big trading state, so obviously we are exporters and importers, but we, you know, a lot of our products, practically every sector is, you know, an international, more than half of the businesses. If you're talking about Washington wheat, 90% of it is exported. If you're talking about our agriculture, other agricultural products, it's export. If you talk about airplanes, the markets are exports. So we care about both, but I'm interested in following on the discussion about the congestion that is occurring at the ports. And Mr. Butler, you mentioned some of the innovation that is occurring to try to temporarily move these containers to other locations. What else should we be doing to try to expedite that? And what should we be doing? I'm not so sure how much discussion has happened on the rail side this morning, because obviously the price of rail affects this issue as well. And a few years ago, we had really exacerbated problems of ag product not even being able to get onto the rail because oil was pushing it off. So what do we need to do to help get more innovation and moving congestion out of the ports on these containers? And what do we need to do to think about rail? And maybe Mr. Reagan or Mr. Doyle, you can answer that.
Chair Cantwell, you've hit the nail on the head, which is that we, you know, our ports are the interface with the sea, and that is the most valuable commercial real estate in our country, and it is limited in terms of space. We know in many of these ports there's not much room to grow physically, so we have to use that space as efficiently as possible. And to the extent that we can move some of that activity off of the terminals, that provides a buffer that keeps things moving. And that's essentially what we're trying to do right now in Southern California. There's a big push in both directions. One is to get importers to pick up their cargo and find someplace else to put it, which is a real challenge for them in many cases. So I'm not pointing fingers, but that has to happen.
Because the warehouses are stacked too.
Correct.
Okay, so this is, the problem is, you know, we're importing a lot in general. And your testimony specifies why that is, because we're making it easier for people to do that too.
Right, and so, but the port, if you will, is the commons for everybody that imports and exports. So if somebody has a warehouse space problem, if that impacts every other user of that port, that's not the best solution. Really, we have to, and this is what I mentioned in my opening statement, is that this is new. We have saturation throughout the entire land side of the supply chain. We really haven't seen that before. So we're working through this in a way for the first time. So all those pieces have to fall together at the same time. And at the same time, we're getting lots of pressure, and rightly so, from the administration and others to move out empty containers, right? Because they get in the way as well. If you have too many empties piled up on the port, then that stops imports and exports. I mentioned earlier, one of the things I'm concerned about and would like to work with the committee and the staff on the new legislation is to make sure that we end up with legislation that recognizes that we have to both move exports and reposition empties. Yep. It's
Yep.
two sides of the same coin.
Listen, we were very involved in getting new federal freight legislation. We said freight can't wait, so maybe the new motto is empties have to be moved. So we got to get them somewhere else. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll take for the record, if I could, Mr. Reagan, because I see our colleagues waiting. We have to get to a vote on that about the rail. I'm very serious about the rail part of this equation, because I do think that also affects people. When the rail prices are so high, people don't move the product. They'd rather sit there and wait for another route. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Cantwell. Senator Lee, you are recognized for your questions.
Thanks so much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for holding this hearing. At the outset of the COVID-19 pandemic, e-commerce sales spiked abruptly, and this is something that had a tendency to frustrate and did frustrate our already troubled supply chain infrastructure and workforce. Now, some of the challenges included truck driver shortages. Others involved outdated scheduling technology or port concentration, lack of storage capacity for containers, port labor difficulties and shortages, and scarce freight equipment, including things like truck chassis. I want to make very clear, these are not just coastal state issues. Utah, not a coastal state, it's entirely landlocked. And yet Utahns and Utah businesses are very directly feeling the effects of our supply chain backlog. And they're experiencing everything from empty store shelves, online orders taking weeks for delivery for things that used to take days, and price hikes basically across the board. Sometimes more excessive with some goods than others, but they're being felt everywhere. Utahns and Americans generally are, of course, looking for solutions right now. And while we certainly will have to address some of the long-term root causes of these problems, it's not something that should distract us from the fact that there are also temporary but immediate actions that I think we can and must take in order to ease the backlogs, especially in time for the holidays. I've packaged some of these shorter-term actions into a single bill, a bill that I refer to as the Stop the Grinch Act. Mr. Butler, I'd like to just start with you on this, because in your testimony you mentioned the lack of container storage as an issue, and that U.S. landside capacity simply can't keep up with the volume of import cargo. Now, it seems to me like we need both short and long-term capacity. In the long term, I think there are a lot of options that are attractive, including things like the Utah Inland Port, which can store containers and ease the burden. But that takes a while, of course. So in the shorter term, would temporarily using some land managed by the Bureau of Land Management for multiple uses to store overflow containers, is that something that could help alleviate the challenges with landside capacity?
Senator, there's no question that among the tools everyone's looking at is temporary inland storage. With respect to any particular piece of property, there's a whole laundry list of things you have to go through to know if it's going to work. Is it in the right place? Can you secure it, et cetera?
Sure. I'm just referring to extra space generally. I assume that would be helpful if we could free up extra space.
That would be helpful, yes.
Now, you also mentioned the availability of truck chassis. So not only are containers sitting on chassis, rendering them useless for additional transportation needs until the container can be delivered, but the emergence of more e-commerce has also highlighted the need for more truck chassis as well. Do you think increasing the amount of available chassis would help alleviate the backlog? If we could do that, overall, increase the number of chassis, would that be beneficial?
Overall, it would probably help, but when I talk to people in the terminals and at the ports, frankly, what I hear most often is we need to use what we have better. We need to keep things moving.
Right. And to that end, to the end of using what we have better, what about expediting the processing of TWIC credentials? Would that help some of the workforce challenges at the port?
I have not heard of that being a limitation at this point.
From what I understand, it is, and the information I've gathered suggests that it is, and all three of these issues that I've just mentioned are addressed in the Stop the Grinch Act, which includes temporary solutions to a lot of those same problems. Now, Mr. Butler, there has been a lot of conversation about rerouting cargo to less congested ports. Is that happening? And to the extent it's not, what are some of the challenges that is causing that to not happen?
It has happened, and it's happened over the 18 months we have seen this surge. Often, though, what happens if you move too much cargo, you just create a problem in another place. I mean, there's a reason the cargo goes where it goes today. That's where the infrastructure is. That's where the customers are. So that's something that's been done on the margins by a lot of our members to try to maintain schedule reliability and keep things moving, but it's not something you can do on a wholesale basis.
Could temporary Jones Act flexibility help with the rerouting of cargo, or at least with the transfer of cargo off of a ship anchored off the coast of another vessel?
Senator, we have both Jones Act and non-Jones Act members, and we have a policy within our organization of not taking positions on the Jones Act.
No, I understand. I understand, and you and I may disagree on the Jones Act itself. I'm just saying that in a time of diminished capacity and diminished supply, sometimes it can be helpful to utilize provisions already built into the law that allow for that.
Senator, if I may.
Port depth is also an issue. Port depth also sometimes frustrates our ability to reroute because we don't have access to dredging. I'm out of time, but if you wanted to weigh in, I'd be happy to hear from you as well.
Sure. When you talk about waiving the Jones Act, and I know what you're essentially talking about is short sea shipping, which we have done a very thoughtful proposal to create a national maritime highway. What your proposal does in this bill does not address the underlying problem, the underlying hurdle that we have towards creating a national maritime highway, which is the double taxation issue. Waiving the Jones Act would do nothing to promote greater shipping opportunities or actually to make it better to be able to move ship across up and down coasts and between U.S. ports. There are reasonable and strong ways to do this. Unfortunately, just waiving the Jones Act is not the way to accomplish this goal.
Yeah, well, I strongly beg to differ, especially given that rerouting can be more possible. You can reroute and not have to deal with the Jones Act as much if you have access to more ports capable of receiving vessels that have made the transoceanic voyage. But we have access to so few dredging ships, and our ports are less deep than they need to be. We have fewer international ports capable of receiving these vessels. And so that's a problem as well that needs to be addressed. I see my time's expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Lee. Well, as we're closing this hearing, I just want to kind of have one more question to think through. These are some of the points that came up. And Mr. Butler, you mentioned how the most valuable space is in our oceans there, and it's limited, and there's not much capacity to be able to actually expand those ports out there because of all the kind of development that's already occurred around them. It's difficult, and if you did, it's incredibly expensive. Then there's been issues related to moving cargo to other ports, and that's really what I want to explore, because I think there's a great opportunity for us to use the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence Seaway to a greater extent than is currently being used. Throughout history, it's been used very heavily, and you are able to bring cargo right into the heartland, right, Mr. Doyle, the heartland of America in Michigan and in our ports that we have in the Great Lakes. And if you're going to expand ports and have the capacity, you mentioned sometimes the capacity isn't there. If you're going to invest in capacity, it's a whole lot cheaper to do that with ports throughout the whole Great Lakes system that can handle additional freight that's coming in. But you have to have equitable access to federal resources, and you have to be held to the same standards. We find that the standards for Great Lakes ports are different than they are at other ports around the country, and that includes standards related to CBP and security issues. My question for you, Mr. Reagan, is that how would smaller seaports factor in and thinking about the Great Lakes and other areas, as long as there's equitable distribution of resources to make sure those ports can make the kinds of investments necessary? We know how powerful those investments can be. What are your thoughts?
I think they can play a really important role in expanding our durability when it comes to these types of crises and expand our capacity for moving goods. I think the more the investment that we make into these ports are capable of receiving larger vessels and capable of transporting them more quickly to rail and truck facilities, that is going to be the key to making sure they're successful. It's one thing to be able to bring a ship in and dock it. It's another thing to have the access to the rest of the country that makes that a viable financial option. So making sure that we have those intermodal facilities and having the facilities to be able to move it is the key to making that a success and improving our broader capacity.
Right, and certainly there's no shortage of intermodal capacity in the industrial Midwest with significant rail assets and highways and material that comes through there. Mr. Doyle, I'm sure if material came through the Port of Monroe, that's a whole lot closer to you than someplace else, and an opportunity for us to grow economies in those areas while also dealing with what is a significant problem. So certainly would look forward to chatting with each of our witnesses in the future about how we can think that through, because I think it's certainly an option that needs to be fully considered. I'd like to reiterate my appreciation for each of our witnesses. Thank you so much for being here today. This is a big issue, it's an important issue, and it's a complex issue. And we need to all get together and put our heads together to think through how we deal not just with the short-term issues, as you mentioned, Mr. Doyle, for king for a few moments, which it's always good to be king. But it's not just the short-term issues, but the long-term issues. This is not something that's going to go away anytime soon, and it will continue to be complex. And we will continue, this committee will continue to explore those issues, from ocean shipping to the intermodal issues when you get here to the United States as well. The hearing record will remain open for 2 weeks. Any senators that would like to submit questions for the record should do so within 2 weeks. And with that, this hearing is now concluded and adjourned.